So, is this something that happens in your classroom? You're making sure you ask lots of questions because we know that questions are good for student engagement, but it ends up being the same student that's always answering everything. And it's hard because it's great that this student wants to show you what they know, but we don't want it to be at the expense of the other learners, do we?
I know what you mean. I think this happens quite a lot. It's a difficult thing to manage, but it is manageable.
I'm Abby.
I'm Charlotte.
And you're listening to a My World of ELT podcast.
And in this episode, we're going to be talking about our own experiences of managing those dominant or enthusiastic students. So, how often would you say this happens in your classes?
Pretty much every lesson, I think, to some extent, because I think there are always going to be students that are more confident or quicker to respond or are just, I don't know, feeling on it that day or a bit enthusiastic. So I think it would be incredibly rare to actually have a lesson where every single student contributes entirely equally. I don't know.
Yeah.
Is that even possible? I don't think that's possible.
Me neither. Absolutely. I'd say the same. It just happens so often. But do you think those students even realise that they're taking over?
It depends, I guess, because sometimes it's a personality thing. You naturally get students who are more chatty, tend to be leaders in a conversation. So I guess if it's part of their personality, they might not even realise that they're doing that. And I think as well, there are cultural aspects to it. So perhaps that's just something they're used to doing. They've done it all their life. You know, they know the answer, they shout it out. But it's complicated because if you're dealing with a class full of students, they don't necessarily know each other very well. And there may be certain dynamics at play there that contribute towards who answers, who speaks up, who stays quiet. So, yeah, it's hard to know if students are aware that it's happening.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, isn't there? And there's also, of course, sometimes some students are just having good days or bad days. Perhaps they're more interested in the topic that day. It's really engaged them and they've got a lot to say. And other days they just might be a bit quieter and, it's not quite doing the same as other lessons do for them.
Absolutely.
But it's interesting. I was going to say it's interesting what you say about personality and culture. Do you think that's a bit of a balance between them? Like, do you think culture does play a part in it?
It really, really massively plays a part in it. And I think it's probably very noticeable when you teach mixed nationalities. If you've got a monolingual class, perhaps that's less evident, although family culture comes into it a lot as well, not just national culture. But I know from experience that there are students that I've taught before where that's a sign of a good student is someone who shouts out. That's what they've been brought up believing and seeing in their educational systems. And in contrast to that, there are other students where that's considered quite disrespectful and quite rude. So they will really struggle to just shout out an answer. They will wait until their turn because they've been brought up to believe that that's quite bad manners. So there's all of those things going on as on top of, is this student being quiet because they don't know what to say or they don't know the answer, or is it all these other factors at play?
And of course, with that cultural aspect, there are certain cultures who they might be happy to speak out in the class, but they wouldn't call out. They'd want you to ask them. They'd wait to be invited because of that sort of teacher respect, the respectful relationship they have with the teacher.
Yeah, you're quite right. It's almost like answers by invitation only, isn't it? They would never assume that it's their place to just call out in the middle of a lesson.
Yeah.
So, Charlotte, in your experience, what kind of impact do you think this can have on the other learners in the group?
Well, unfortunately, I think it can have quite a negative impact on other learners. I think sometimes it can kind of affect their confidence. If someone is calling out all the time, perhaps they don't feel they're as good. And if the teacher kind of tunes into that dominant student and accepts a lot of those answers, then they might actually end up feeling quite demotivated. And on the other hand as well, you've got those students who might enjoy it because they can be a bit lazy and get away with not answering. What
Yeah,
about you?
we all recognize those students as well,
Yeah.
don't we? Want to take a back seat. Well, it's interesting actually what you said about the teacher tuning into that dominant student, because I think it can sometimes feed our ego as a teacher. If we've got a student that's answering lots of questions, that makes us feel good because it makes us feel as though we're doing a good job and this person gets it. So I think subconsciously it can be quite easy to give them a bit more attention and
Yeah.
and not realize maybe that there are others that are not taking part so much.
Absolutely. And you get to the end of the lesson, you think, oh, that went really well because there was so much participation. But actually, on reflection, you might think that the participation was limited to that one particular student or one or two students.
Yeah, that can be easy to overlook in the moment, can't it?
Yeah.
We talked earlier about putting it down to different personalities as well as culture. Do you think these are the only reasons? Is it simply down to students having different personalities? Could a student learn to be a bit more dominant in the classroom?
I think possibly a student could learn to be more dominant in the classroom if they wanted to, but perhaps when it comes to personality, you know, the way we are as students reflects who we are as people. So if we're a quiet person, if we're a shy person, then perhaps we're more likely to be, a quiet student in the class and take a back seat, as you said. But if we're a flamboyant, outgoing, extrovert, in our everyday lives, then, it's likely, I would have thought, that that's the kind of personality we're going to portray in the classroom.
So, in that case, do you think that it is entirely the responsibility of the teacher to manage that? Can we manage it?
I think it is our responsibility as teachers to manage that because I think, as we've touched on, students don't necessarily know they're doing it. So they're not likely to address it or change it. Other students in the class may think it's all right, they may not, but they're not necessarily likely to challenge it or say anything about it. So I think really as teachers, it's our responsibility to manage our classroom and just manage that situation.
It can be easy to deny that responsibility, can't it? And say, well, it's just
Yes.
how they are. It's
Yeah.
not my problem. I just ask the questions. But yeah, I think you're quite right. That's all part of classroom management, isn't it? It's making sure that everybody's getting something out of the lesson and everybody's contributing as well. Okay, so we've talked about the fact that we do think it is the teacher's responsibility to manage this situation in class and those dominant students. So, if that's the case, do you have any tips for teachers out there that might be wondering how they can do this?
Well, I think a really kind of easy thing to do, which hopefully should be accessible for most people, is to just record one of their lessons, and then watch it back and see, were there any students dominating? Because I think it can be really hard to tell in the moment. You're focusing on your plan, you're working out what your handouts you're going to give for your next activity. There's a lot going on. But I think if you've got that recording, you can go back over it and really focus in on what was happening with all of your students.
That's a really good point because I think, as you said, in the moment, it probably is those dominant students that are going to be getting your attention. So it's only after the event, if you were to watch back a recording of the lesson, you might spot things you didn't even notice at the time, like a particular student that was quiet that day that it hadn't even been on your radar.
Absolutely. And what about you, Abby, on your teacher training courses? How do you address this?
Well, we talk a lot about student engagement on our teacher training courses. And I think the biggest thing really is to make sure that we're getting teachers to reflect on student engagement and not just how much collective student participation was there, but was that evenly distributed? So it's a question that we're constantly asking our trainee teachers. Think back over the lesson. What part of the lesson was there most engagement? Which part of the lesson was there least engagement? Who was engaged? How do you know? What were they doing? So I think constantly encouraging this reflective practice and getting teachers to analyze, pick it apart. What did you notice? Because I think quite often we finish a lesson and we're moving on to the next one already. But that process of digesting it and really thinking about what worked, what didn't, who answered, who didn't, making that part of your routine can raise awareness. And if you're aware, then you're in a position to do something about it.
Absolutely.
If you would like some tips on do's and don'ts when dealing with this situation, or if you'd like to learn more about a teaching technique that can help to encourage more equal participation, click on the link to see our free downloads.
And did you know that we also have a language module on this topic? Go to our website to check out our bite-sized language modules, focusing on practical classroom phrases and teaching tips on a range of topics.
So thanks for listening to this My World of ELT podcast, and see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.